welcome to our third Poolside Proficiency presentation of 2025. My name is Carolyn Taylor, and I'm an instructional strategist with Wayside Publishing, and we're so pleased to have you along today. In this third segment of our Poolside Proficiency series, we will explore talking to students and stakeholders about language proficiency. As a reminder, the content from this webinar is only one component of the overall professional learning available for this topic. In addition to this recorded webinar, access the Poolside Proficiency document to find a related blog post, podcast episode, and an opportunity to reflect and read reactions from other educators. You'll also be able to access the link to register for our second and final live event on August 11th. Remember, too, that you can request a professional learning certificate to receive credit for interacting with this content. Here are our learning goals for our time together today. And for more information and links to register for our upcoming live events, you can head to the website shown here. So by the end of our session, it is our hope that you'll be able to talk about the relationship between performance and proficiency. We'd like you to be able to identify key differences between language proficiency at the novice and intermediate levels. And then finally, we hope you'll be able to explain general principles of proficiency growth to both students and stakeholders. During today's webinar, I will be referring to some resources to help students understand what novice and intermediate level language looks like. And here is where you can access these resources that are part of today's webinar. To get us in the mindset of being able to talk about the importance of language proficiency in language learning, I'd like you to jot down your responses to a few framing questions. You might want to pause the video to collect your thoughts and then respond as you go along. So first, in your view, why is it important for students themselves to know about language proficiency? Now, write down some of the benefits of helping stakeholders, such as parents, administrators, school board members, understand language proficiency. And finally, write down some of your thoughts and reflections on how your understanding of proficiency level guides and informs your teaching. I polled some of my colleagues to get their take on how students knowing about language proficiency is of benefit to them. And so here are some of the responses that they shared. And I think generally speaking, when students understand their language proficiency, they're able to gain valuable insights that empower them to become more effective, motivated, and independent language learners. And this knowledge helps pave the way for greater academic, personal, and future professional success. All right, so now let's take a look at the benefits of stakeholders knowing about language proficiency. Knowing the benefits of foreign language study is crucial because it highlights the many cognitive, cultural, and career advantages that come along with language learning. And these benefits go beyond simply being able to communicate with more people. They foster personal growth, they help learners think critically, and develop a deeper understanding of the world. And here are some of the takeaways that my colleagues shared about their view of how knowing about language proficiency benefits stakeholders. And for our last question, how do proficiency levels guide our teaching? Proficiency levels provide such a valuable framework for language teaching by informing teachers about learner abilities, guiding goal setting, differentiating instruction, and supporting assessment practices. By understanding and using these levels, teachers can create more effective and engaging learning experiences that help students develop the communicative competence they need to succeed in the language. So, here again are some of the comments my colleagues shared about their opinions on how knowing about proficiency levels are able to guide our teaching practices. So, to understand proficiency, it's important to consider it in relation to performance. They both require using the target language to communicate, but let's look at the relationship between the two. How are they different? And why is it important for us as teachers to understand those differences? So, as you can see here with the ACTFL definitions, there's an important distinction between the two. So, essentially, performance is the language that our learners can use having experienced it in familiar contexts. Right. So essentially, the classroom learning that they do would prepare them for performance, right? If they were going to take a formative assessment, a summative assessment, etc. Proficiency, on the other hand, has an element of spontaneity to it. Sure, the students can pull from what they've learned in the classroom, but they're using the language in real world situations where they can't anticipate what they're going to have to express in the conversation. They don't know what would come up. All right, so next I'm going to share a few scenarios, and I want you to decide whether they are describing language performance or language proficiency. Here's the first one. So, after completing a food unit, Madame Bonnet takes her French 1 students to a local French restaurant to try out their new learning. At the restaurant, students are required to converse with each other in French, drawing upon what they've learned in class during the food unit. Okay, so is this an example of performance or proficiency? It is performance. And what stands out here is that students are applying targeted classroom learning. Okay, next we have a scenario where Madame Rill's AP French students are getting ready for a student exchange with teens from France. And the French teens will be arriving in Lafayette, Louisiana, where the students live, and they'll join Madame Rill's students on a field trip to the Acadian Cultural Center. There, the French students will learn about the history, customs, and language of the Acadians who became Louisiana's Cajuns. And since much of the tour is given in Cajun French, Madame Rille's students will be on hand to interpret in standard French for the exchange students. Okay, if you decided this was proficiency, you're right. So Madame Rille's students can't anticipate the Cajun words and expressions the French exchange students will have, and so they're not necessarily prepared to answer specific questions that come up. Okay. In this scenario, Madame Germineau is a French teacher who just completed a cross curricular unit on the performing arts with her French 3 class. She decides to take her students to a local showing of Les Miserables, followed by an outing to a local cafe. Now, at this cafe, students are expected to complete a portion of their unit summative assessment to converse in French about the performance by providing their opinions of the production design, the performance, and in that process, they've got to incorporate discourse connectors and narrate in multiple time frames that they've learned in class. Keep in mind that students have rehearsed these functions extensively in class. All right, what do you think? So this is performance. And as we saw before, the students are using specific rehearsed classroom learning with targeted criteria for speaking French. So, to recap, in simple terms, performance involves using language skills in the familiar environment of the classroom versus in the unpredictable real world of the target language culture. And to give students the opportunity to explore this, you could have them work in groups and draw images on chart paper representing performance versus proficiency. They could then have a gallery walk where each group explains their drawing and classmates have a chance to add their observations and insights. And if students want to go digital, they could create a comic strip relating language performance or proficiency using a free online storyboarding creator, such as the ones that you see here. Here's another strategy to help your students understand performance versus proficiency. You can give them a blank Venn diagram and then share this image with them. Next, you'd have students rephrase the ones that they see, allowing them to put in their own words similarities and differences between performance and proficiency. So now that we've made the distinction between performance and proficiency, let's take a deeper dive into proficiency. Here are the 11 ACTFL proficiency levels. And one way you may have heard the levels described is that at the novice level, we function like parrots. And then as we move up to the intermediate level, we're using survival language. Then, as we get into the advanced levels, we're storytellers and we can function in the target language in work settings. Finally, at the superior level, we're experts in the target language. And notice that as you progress through these levels, the cone increases in depth and breadth. So as we level up, we're able to extend our language use for various purposes in a variety of contexts. So in other words, the functions, right? We're also able to expand our ability to use language forms or related vocabulary and grammar structures. And as we build our proficiency, we're able to understand and communicate in the target language with increasing skill, accuracy, fluency, and effectiveness. Have you ever given much thought about the time frame for building proficiency? I think this is something that parents often want to know. How long will it take my student to become proficient in French, for example? So here we see the length of time it takes beginning learners to reach the various ranges of the novice, intermediate, and advanced levels. And keep in mind that this applies to Group 1 languages that you see listed here. And since most of our learners are middle through high school age, we've highlighted the novice and intermediate ranges. So think about the implications this has for our learners who may become easily frustrated when they can't express themselves in the target language as well as they would like to. especially when they compare their target language proficiency to their first language. Seeing the length of time reflected here can help students put things into perspective. And since this reflects classroom learning, students who want to go beyond the novice or intermediate ranges can immerse themselves in the target language outside of school by taking part in community activities where language is spoken to the extent that that's possible in your communities, maybe travel opportunities. They could subscribe to print resources. They could listen to podcasts, create playlists, watch movies, etc., all in the target language. In general terms, here are the hallmarks of each proficiency level. And again, since most of our learners are at the novice and intermediate range, we'll focus on what they can do at that level. At the novice level, learners can communicate using formulaic lists and phrases. For example, they might be able to list their favorite classes or movies, or maybe identify which activities they like to do in their free time. Then at the intermediate level, learners can create with language. They can ask and answer simple questions on familiar topics, and they can also handle a simple situation or transaction. For example, students might ask and answer questions about their daily routines. Let's say maybe purchase a latte at Starbucks or talk about Friday night's football game. And I do want to point out too that when students are at the high range of any given proficiency level, they're capable of carrying out some of those next level functions according to the descriptors, but they just can't do it every single time. So, for example, intermediate high learners can sometimes function at the advanced low level and narrate in all time frames, maybe even handle a situation with a complication, but they just can't do it consistently. So they've got one foot in the next level, but they're not yet on solid ground there. And here's something else to think about. Some people don't even reach the distinguished level in their first language. The anchor chart that you see here highlights what novice and intermediate learners can do across language domains. So let's consider each of these domains. So language functions are the first. Then we have content and context. And then finally, we have text type. So it's important to think about how these three characteristics work together to describe not only what students know and are able to do in the target language, but how well they're able to do it. So let's take a closer look at these three aspects of performance. We'll concentrate first on sentence structures and consider what students can do at the sentence level, building from the novice to the intermediate range. Our novice students use practiced or memorized words and phrases, and as they build, they're able to communicate in simple sentences until they're using them most of the time. And then the shift to the intermediate range happens when students are able to create their own simple sentences and can extend their use to series of sentences. And when students are able to communicate in paragraphs, now they're approaching the advanced range. And here we can see with context and content that students are starting out at that bottom of the novice range using practiced or memorized words and phrases, right? They rely on ways that teachers make that input comprehensible, maybe, gestures or visuals, repeating, rephrasing. Okay, and then as we move up, we see that at the beginning of the intermediate range, now students are able to create simple sentences. Okay, and then building up to the high end of intermediate, where the students are now using those connected sentences with discourse connectors, and they can combine them into paragraph level discourse. With language functions, if we think about the novice range, students are able to maybe introduce themselves, ask others what their names are, right? And then they can identify people and give a brief description. And as they work up to the intermediate, now they're able to not just identify people, but they can describe those people and the places and things that are on the topic. And then you can see here that advancing upward, they can talk about events and experience using various tenses in various time frames. Here's an example of an activity that you could do with your students. If they're at the novice level, you could have them do this activity in English. Give them a list of proficiency levels you would like to highlight and give some key descriptions of that proficiency level. Next, list some basic contexts or functions, and then ask students to describe the topic using one of the proficiency levels. For example, you might ask your students, how would a novice learner describe a taco? How would an intermediate learner invite a friend to a party? You could even use the same context or function and have students explain how a novice versus intermediate learner would explain a typical school day. Here are a few more activities you could do with students to help build their understanding of proficiency levels and language output. One I especially like is using rubrics where you would label the four corners of your classroom with a different proficiency level. And also, there you would add in each corner a context and function. So let's say, for example, in one corner, you would label it intermediate low, and the task would be to invite a friend to a concert. So students would work in groups and they would rotate among those four corners. And for that particular corner, they would actually invite a friend to a concert using language that would mirror what an intermediate low speaker would provide. And then after that, students can discuss what language they produced, why did it have these characteristics, and how do those characteristics match up with what would be expected of an intermediate low speaker. Here's another activity that you can do with students to help them understand language proficiency. These activity cards from Kara Parker with Creative Language class are with those resources that I shared with you in your Google folder. So they're designed to help students collaborate to build their understanding of proficiency levels and what language output looks like across those levels. The cards give the instructions for students, so you would cut them out and then you'd group students. For a level 1 class, you wouldn't need to use the intermediate mid and intermediate high cards. Students would write their answers in English on a large poster paper or piece of butcher paper, and then you'd have them attach their card to the poster. Once students have completed their poster, you could have them do a gallery walk circulating around the room with their groups to point out features of how the descriptors match the given proficiency level. I'm going to play for you an excerpt from an oral interview done in Spanish. As you're listening, decide whether the speaker is at the novice or intermediate level and why.
Bueno, y con los niños dices que preparas la comida. ¿Qué tipo de comidas tú preparas para ellos?
Pizza.
¿Pizza?
No, y pollo, y broccoli, y ensalada, y refritos, más o menos. Y uno de mis hijos le gusta quesadillas. Son el más mejor que todo.
Bueno.
Which level is she? She is at the novice level, novice low to be exact. For our novice level students, we're focusing on acquiring vocabulary and using simple sentence structures. Here, the speaker is giving one-word answers or listing words. She relies on cognates quite a bit, and we see lots of hesitation and gaps in her communication. Let's listen to an oral interview done in French. Again, at which proficiency level is this person, and what evidence do you have to place her at this level?
Quand vous avez du temps libre, Julie, quand vous n'êtes pas...
Dans mon temps libre, j'aime faire des sports. Moi, j'aime courir. Et aussi, j'aime nager. Quoi d'autre? J'aime lire les livres. Et j'ai fini mon master's. Donc, j'ai étudié beaucoup pour 2 ans ici. Mais, donc, je n'avais pas beaucoup de temps libre pendant les 2 ans, 2 années passées.
J'imagine.
Mais maintenant, je vais trouver mon temps libre enfin.
She is at the intermediate level, intermediate mid, actually. And this is where we introduce more complex grammatical structures and communicative tasks. This speaker uses various time frames when describing her activities. She uses complex sentences and connecting words. To keep the conversation going, she uses gambits, for example, or words to show agreement or, when hesitating, signaling that she needs to give some quick thought to the question before she can share her ideas. I think it's really powerful for students to see language in action, so to speak, and analyze what they're viewing and hearing. Now that our session is coming to an end, let's do a quick progress check on meeting today's objectives. So can you discuss the relationship between performance and proficiency? Are you able to identify key differences between language proficiency at the novice and intermediate levels? And finally, can you explain general principles of proficiency growth to students and stakeholders? Well, I hope you've gathered some valuable ideas and are ready to put them into action when the new school year gets underway. Be sure to check out the rest of the resources available on the document where you access this webinar recording. To find more information about the August 11th Poolside Proficiency Live event and to access future asynchronous content, be sure to visit the link on your screen. And as we wrap up, I'd like to invite you to write down your thoughts on these 3 ideas. So what would be one insight that you've gained today about proficiency? And then one change you'd like to make in your teaching or assessment practices. And then finally, what's one lingering question or issue you have about proficiency? And finally, if you'd like to receive a certificate for participating in today's professional learning session, scan the QR code or go to the URL you see here to request the form. And once you've filled out the form, you'll receive an email with a link to register for our second and final live event. So mark your calendars for August 11th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. We hope to see you there. On behalf of our professional learning team and from all of us here at Wayside Publishing, thank you for joining us for Poolside Proficiency. And here's to a great rest of your summer.